when we're pleasing people, we think we're making somebody else happy, but in reality, it's not up to us to be in control of anybody else's emotions. And people will say, I did this for so many years and I just didn't get anything back because I thought that I was doing something to make the other person happy. But in the end, I was just teaching them how to manipulate me, or I was doing all of this stuff thinking that then I would be accepted. And yet I still don't feel accepted. So it doesn't always get us what we want either, but it also doesn't have the effect on the other person that we think it's going to. I've never met anybody who said, I spent all these years pleasing somebody and now my life is better because the other person is happy. It's quite the opposite, usually. The more that you keep giving, the more they want to take, and the worse you feel. And it creates this cycle that perpetuates. When we are not doing well in life, our judgment gets clouded, our emotions are influencing our thoughts so much that it's hard to see what's really going on. And our thoughts get clouded behind this gray cloud where we start to make negative assumptions. We believe things that aren't true, and our brain tricks us into thinking that I'm the problem, or I need to do this, or somebody else can't exist without me doing X, Y, or Z. And we get really caught up into believing a lot of things that aren't true. Part of getting healthier is knowing that just because you think something doesn't mean it's true. Your brain lies to you, it plays tricks on you, and that you don't have to act in accordance with what you think. So if your brain says, hey, you can't do that, sometimes the best thing you can possibly do to grow stronger is to say, challenge accepted. I'm going to try to go do that thing that my brain is saying I can't do.
Well, Amy Morin, I will start with a quote from you. Time doesn't heal anything. It's how we deal with that time that determines the speed at which we heal. That's a quote from you. It's a bit of unconventional wisdom. What brought you to that?
So many people would come into my therapy office saying, like, hey, it's been 10 years since I went through this thing. How come I'm not doing better?
Hmm.
And they totally bought into that idea that if you just wait long enough, then things naturally get better. But it's not true. It's not true at all. And unfortunately, I would have to break the news to people that you actually haven't even started working on this yet, even though it's been 5 years or 10 years and you've been waiting, you've been idle that whole time. And because you haven't started working on it yet, you're nowhere near healing yet. And to now to talk about it and to start working on these things, you actually might start to feel a little bit worse before you get better. So talk about not the best news to have to break to somebody once they finally found the courage to say, "Hey, I need some help," and for you to have to say, "Well, look, we're starting from square one here. However, we can get you there."
Yeah.
And it's probably not going to be as bad as you think it is. We're just going to have to do some work to get there.
Hmm. Some work to get there. What is there?
Yeah. So when I talk about mental strength, it's about saying this is how you're going to reach your full potential in life. But again, what does that mean?
Yeah.
I think the greatest thing we can kind of hope for is that by the time we are hopefully 100 years old, that when we look back over our lives, we're able to say, yeah, like I lived it well, and that I
Mhm.
enjoyed my time that I had. And I am proud of myself for the decisions that I made. And I was brave and I found courage, and not everything worked out, but I learned a lot of lessons along the way too.
Yeah. And with this idea of time not healing all things too, with people who experience narcissistic abuse, there's this idea of a trauma bond, and some people I've talked to, they say that time doesn't heal a trauma bond. Um, so what does like what's going into healing in a situation like that?
A lot of it has to do with changing the way that we think.
Hmm.
When we are not doing well in life, our judgment gets clouded, our emotions are influencing our thoughts so much that it's hard to see what's really going on. And our thoughts get clouded behind this gray cloud where we start to make negative assumptions. We believe things that aren't true, and our brain tricks us into thinking that I'm the problem, or I need to do this, or somebody else can't exist without me doing X, Y, or Z. And we get really caught up into believing a lot of things that aren't true. Part of getting healthier is knowing that just because you think something doesn't mean it's true. Your brain lies to you, it plays tricks on you, and that you don't have to act in accordance with what you think. So if your brain says, hey, you can't do that, sometimes the best thing you can possibly do to grow stronger is to say, challenge accepted. I'm going to try to go do that thing that my brain is saying I can't do.
And one of the things that you urge people to change in your first book, or maybe caution against, is being a people pleaser. Narcissists and psychopaths often target people who have these people-pleasing behaviors. What is the threat of being a people pleaser?
So for a lot of us, it's about losing sight of who we are and what's important in life. We forget, like, what are my own opinions? I've worked with people in my therapy office who'll say, I can't make a decision because I don't even know what it is that I like. If
Yeah.
my friend says to me, where do you want to go to lunch today, Mexican or Chinese? In my head, I'm thinking, which one do I think they like the best? Because I just don't even know what I like anymore. And when we start to lose sight of those little things, it's really also about the fact that we've lost sight of our deeper values. Like, how are you spending your time? What are your priorities? Like, what's really important to you in life? And of course, this idea that when we're pleasing people, we think we're making somebody else happy. But in reality, it's not up to us to be in control of anybody else's emotions. And people will say, I did this for so many years and I just didn't get anything back because I thought that I was doing something to make the other person happy. But in the end, I was just teaching them how to manipulate me. Or I was doing all of this stuff thinking that then I would be accepted. And yet I still don't feel accepted. So it doesn't always get us what we want either. But it also doesn't have the effect on the other person that we think it's going to. I've never met anybody who said, I spent all these years pleasing somebody and now my life is better because the other person is happy. It's quite the opposite, usually. The more that you keep giving, the more they want to take, and the worse you feel. And it creates this cycle that perpetuates.
Yeah, so that becomes the relationship dynamic then. You said it's a perpetuating cycle. Is there any way to break out of it?
There certainly is. I think there's hope to break out of any of our negative and unhealthy cycles in life. And sometimes it's just recognizing the pattern that we're in. And it takes courage to do because I think, oh no, I can't upset the apple cart. If I do something different, then everything's going to fall apart. But that's actually the recipe sometimes is to say, I'm going to do something a little bit different. You don't have to do anything huge. You don't have to wake up tomorrow and say, I'm going to transform my entire life. But sometimes it's just about finding that one small step that you can change. Might be that you say no, or you speak up for yourself, or in your own mind, you just start reminding yourself, I deserve self-respect. And with all of those little changes that we make, sometimes that helps us to build courage, that starts to build momentum, has the snowball effect of a snowball rolling down a hill, picks up more snow and gets bigger. We want to do that so that after a while we feel like, okay, I have that momentum and now I have the courage to take that next little step too.
Yeah. And what you're talking about here, you're talking about what an individual can do. You talk more in your book about, understanding where you have control and where you don't. So trying to control the relationship dynamic of two, probably out of reach, whereas it's about controlling your individual approach to your relationships.
It is. Like, I think we have huge influence over people around us,
Hmm.
but we can't control them.
Yeah.
But the closer your relationship is to somebody, the more influence you have. So you're going to have a lot more influence over a partner or your children than you would your next door neighbor, of course. But the good news is, we instead of trying to change how somebody else is behaving or acting or what they're doing, you just focus on what could I change? And if you think of it like a dance, when you change your steps, the other person kind of naturally has to change theirs. So if you say, like, what am I going to do differently today? Well, instead of raising my voice or instead of getting mad or nagging or instead of trying to guess what you want to do, I'm going to try something else today and then just watch what happens. But to know that just because it doesn't go smoothly the first time doesn't mean it was a bad idea. When you change your behavior, often the other person will do anything they can to try to make you go back to your way that you usually do things. So they might get angry, they might yell, they might beg, they might lecture you or warn you. And sometimes that means, oh, this is definitely a boundary I needed to set. It tells you, yeah, this is exactly where I need to be because they're pushing back so hard. So it's uncomfortable for them. But that's what makes people change is when they're uncomfortable. If things are too comfortable for people, then they don't have any motivation to do anything differently.
Yeah. A lot of what you talk about is these changes, these experiments in your behavior or in how you deal with other people. How would you structure a self-experiment like that?
So sometimes it's about taking a step back and saying, what's the situation? What is it that I'm doing? And what might be contributing to it? And then just look for that one little thing you could do differently. So, for example, I worked with a woman whose partner would go to the bar on the way home from work, drink heavily, come home, and they would always get into some sort of an argument. She'd say, you should come straight home from work. You just drove when after you've been drinking. This is terrible. It's awful. And So then the next day, he was motivated less to come home because he knew he was going to get yelled at. And it created this cycle where he didn't want to go home. She was mad at him if he didn't come home. And so she's screaming at him every day, which makes him then less likely to come home. So the strategy that we used was instead of doing that, why don't you say, hey, dinner's going to be on the table at 5 p.m., which is when he got out of work, and make it about something positive to come home to and just see what happens. And when she did that, he became a little more likely to come straight home from work. And then she would make a big deal out of this is so great that you came home from work. Thank you so much. It was great to see you. And if he didn't, then she just put dinner in the fridge and he could eat leftovers later or not. But instead of turning it into a big deal, she would just then go to her room and read a book. And for her, that little change made a huge difference. She just sort of said, I'm going to take the behavior that we currently have and just find one little small spot where I can make a difference. And for her, it was that when he walked through the door, instead of yelling or nagging or berating him, she was going to do something just a little bit different. I'm going to welcome him home as long as he's exhibiting the behavior I want to see. And sometimes that's all it takes is saying, all right, the next time my partner gets angry or yells at me, instead of yelling back, what am I going to do? Or instead of immediately jumping up to see what I think it is that I did wrong, what if I just spoke up and said something? Or what if I didn't say anything at all? And in order to do that, though, we have to take that step back to really have that objective fly on the wall view of how does this unfold? What is it I do? What is it my partner does? And then plan ahead. And whatever you try, it might not work. The first few times you might think, all right, I don't think this has the effect I want. So then try something else and know that you can try an experiment, but stick with it for a little bit just to see if it works first.
Yeah. This does seem to depend on the other person being a relatively sincere person. So, for example, if you were to say try to change behavior with someone who is, NPD, psychopath, we call them a dark personality, um, they might do something like apologize. Say, I owe you an apology. But in fact, they're going to distract you, gaslight you, maybe brandish some anger to intimidate you, and then tell other people, I apologize. I don't know what their problem is. So how do you recognize that you're dealing with a good actor or not in the first place when you are trying to experiment in your relationships?
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's important to look at somebody's behavior and not just the words coming out of their mouth.
Yeah.
Because if somebody says, I'm so respectful to you, and I always apologize when I make a mistake, but then you look at their behavior. Does it line up? The answer, if it's no, well, then you know, okay, I'm going to ignore all the words coming out of your mouth just because you say I'm sorry, but then you do the exact same thing 3 minutes later, or because you say, I'm doing everything I can, yet from a behavior standpoint, they haven't done anything, then you know, all right, there's no sense in having these certain conversations because those probably aren't going to work out in the long run. And again, I think it would be about getting the objective view. If I were a fly on the wall observing all of this, what would I see as
Mm,
opposed to just what would I hear? Or
mm,
when the person claims up and down, I did everything I could for you, and all I do, everything centers around you. You think, well, does it? And take that step back and just really ask. And to know too that when we are thinking about a lot of these things, we're thinking it from like a logical point of view and we try to get inside the other person's head. Well, if the other person is not well, or we're dealing with somebody who does have a lot of these personality traits, their behavior isn't going to make sense to us, and that's okay. So sometimes you just have to let that go to know, like, I can't always guess this person's next move or the next thing they're going to do might not be exactly the way that I think it is. And so you can figure out, well, how do I need to deal with this person differently? So, for example, communicating boundaries. If you talk to a healthy person, maybe you have a friend in your life and you were to explain to them, hey, I'm not going to answer the phone after 10 p.m. because I need to get up early for work. A healthy person says, no problem. Well, we know somebody with some of these dark personality traits, they're going to call you at 11 p.m. over and over and over again, or they're going to do something to sabotage your efforts. So you might not need to have that conversation up front. You might say, well, with this person, I'm just going to turn the ringer off and show them with my behavior how I want to act. And it's more about how do I show myself self-respect rather than worrying so much about whether this person's going to accept me as I am.
yeah. Another thing too on this sort of what you can control and what you can't that comes up in your work is there's this idea of understanding what you can fix, what you can change. Another threat is that people who are drawn to things like self-help and stuff, they are often enticed by people who are very narcissistic, or cults with this idea that you want to keep fixing things. That this is someone who's going to fix you, who's going to help you change, who's going to have to get better. You join this cult, you don't know it's a cult, and then you get pulled in and you think everybody's here is working to fix and get better. How much do we want to improve, and how do we measure that against maybe some side effects or things?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it is important to be aware of those things that we can get easily pulled into one path and it might not be the right path. I mean, if you look at social media these days, there's a million influencers handing out advice about how they changed their life and how you should also do the exact same things they did because it will change your life too.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's important to take that step back sometimes and be objective about what is it I want for my life? And will doing X, Y, or Z get me there? Does that help me to live the kind of life that I want to live? And for people to make sure that you have trusted people in your life too, friends, family members, people that you can have conversations with about, hey, I'm trying to do this thing over here. And what do you think about it? And be open to feedback. And it's not to say if you're going to go join a yoga retreat and your entire family decides you've gone off the deep end that you need to not go to the yoga retreat. Maybe that's really what you need, but make sure that you're having conversations with people so that you don't get tunnel vision into following just one person or one path or thinking this is the only way to heal or get better in life.
You're reminding me of some big pointers now. Yeah, that one path thing, that's something that they do, and cult leaders and things they'll claim unique access to some sort of higher power or
Yeah.
some sort of authoritative set of information or something like that. And I've seen this in smaller scales. That's very important. Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, I mean everybody's got their own like unique path to healing and there's so many more ways. Or you follow like a biohacker and they will tell you all of these things you have to do to improve your life. And you think, well, all right, well, you don't have to go to bed at 8 p.m. If you did that every day, perhaps your social life suffers, but maybe your health does get better. But and so that's why it's so important to look at things in a balance of how does this affect your financial health, your social health, your mental health, your physical health, your spiritual health. All of those things matter. But when we get that tunnel vision, we're only following that one path. It's easy to let everything else go by the wayside.
Oh yeah. So with this, could we maybe boil it down to how you know what you can control and what you can't control in the first place?
Yeah, really, in so many things in life, we can control our attitude, control your effort.
Yeah.
Most of us, you can control your breathing. There are a lot of things outside of that that you really have no control over. So I think waking up in the morning and saying, I'm in control of how I spend my time, who I spend it with, what sort of attitude I want to adopt. And we're quick sometimes to think we don't have control. Like, I have to work, I have to go to this job that I hate every day. Well, you don't have to. That's a choice. Of course, there'd be a consequence if you don't go, but it's a choice.
Yeah.
Or I have to go to the grocery store. No, you don't. So recognizing those things that we sometimes assume we don't have control over, but then also acknowledging I don't have control over how my partner behaves. I don't have control over whether people have fun if they come over to my dinner party. Well, it's not up to me. I can throw a great dinner party, but the rest, I can buy a gift for somebody, but I can't control if they're going to love it. So many things that it's important to take a step back sometime and say, yeah, I can influence somebody, but I can't control them. And even right down to kids, people that have teenagers will be like, oh, how do I get my kid to study? They're so smart. You can't make them study or absorb the information from the book. You can encourage healthy habits and you can encourage them to set aside, you can give them consequences if they don't spend time doing their homework, but give them rewards if they do a good job, but you can't make them then go in and get an A on their test. So some of that's hard to let go of because we want to have more control. But from the research, we know that the more we try to control, the more anxious we get when we can't control it, which then makes us more anxious and we try to control more. And that's another one of those vicious downward spirals that's easy to fall into.
Yeah. So something else you've talked about, what we do control, there's a risk of giving away our power. How do people give away their power? I think that may be hard to grasp at first.
It is. I think that of all of the 13 things mentally strong people don't do that I talk about, this one has been the one that's raised the most questions from people
Hmm.
because they'll say, well, really, I can't help it. I feel bad about myself because my mother puts me down. Well, if you say that, you're giving your mom permission to control your self-esteem. Or if you say sister was in a bad mood today, so she ruined my day. Then you're giving her control over what kind of day you have, what kind of mood you have. And it's difficult if you've been in the same room with somebody who's in a horrible mood. Obviously, it drags us down, but you have to make that conscious choice of like, I'm choosing to be here. I'm choosing to let this person have this effect on me, but I don't have to. I can control how I think. I can control how I feel. I can control how I behave today. And when we take back our power, it's really about those things. Like, I don't have to. I don't have to let my friend borrow my car if I don't want to. I don't have to let somebody's harsh words ruin my entire day if I don't want to. And that's what it's really all about. When I talk about taking back your power, it's about saying, nope, I'm in control of how I think, how I feel, and how I behave.
And how I feel there, I have a note from my notes in your book too about how other people can regulate your emotions if you let them. How do we make sure that other people don't? Because that seems so sort of mammal to be
Yeah.
influenced by the emotions of others. So what's the barrier there that we can use?
Yeah, so we do know that emotions are contagious.
Yeah.
The ones we enjoy, like if you're in a room with somebody who's really excited, you probably get a little excited too. If you're in a room with somebody who's incredibly anxious, our anxiety tends to go up, right? And we've all felt this. So if you're in the room with somebody who's grumpy or you're in the mood with somebody who's really angry, it's easy to pick up on those emotions too. So then you'd say, well, what are my choices? Can I walk out of the room? Can I get some space? If you can't get physical distance from somebody, try some psychological distance. That could be a couple different ways. You might do some time traveling. All right, when I'm 100 years old and I look back on today, how will I wished I have spent it in a car with a really grumpy person also being really grumpy? Probably not. So then what would I wished I have done today? So time travel can help us get some psychological distance. Another one is to just say, like, what would I say to my friend right now? If my friend said, hey, I'm on this road trip with somebody who's incredibly grumpy, trapped in a car, I'd be like, well, you're doomed. You have to also be grumpy and have road rage. No, you'd probably be like, put on some headphones and make the best of it. So that can help us get a little bit of psychological distance when you can't physically get away from somebody, but also knowing when somebody says rude things to you. You can choose to dwell on it and keep rehashing and ruminating on it, or you can decide, all right, that happened, but I'm not going to let my brain replay that a million times over and over again. But we also know that we're really bad at changing the channel in our brain. If I say,
Mhm.
just don't think about that, I'll think about it even more. So if I had a conversation at noon that didn't go well and it's now 4 p.m. and I'm like, just don't think about that, it keeps popping up more. But if I distract myself with something, even if I'm like, I'm going to take 2 minutes to organize my desk, or I'm going to go outside and go for a quick walk, or I'm going to talk about something completely different with my friend, that like physically changes your brain a little bit. And even though your brain might go back to it later, you might be in a better mood. So then you can at least replay that situation with a different perspective instead of thinking, oh, I said the wrong thing or it's all my fault. If you feel a little bit better, you might then be able to say, you know what? I did the best I could, or that person shouldn't have said that, because you have a little bit of a different perspective on it. So don't let yourself just keep replaying those things and rehashing and ruminating things that don't work out for you or that don't help you to feel better.
Mhm. Could we get really granular on an example here? I'm
Sure.
thinking of messages that are sent to provoke, emails, text messages, maybe deliberately confusing, maybe engaging others too, to sort of, shame you, put a spotlight on you, things like that. Now, the one attitude you could have in this is, I won't engage with this person. I'm going to ignore
Yep.
this. But then the not responding can become a sort of loop. And then there's I'm drafting a reply for
Right, right.
days, you know. Um, with that one specifically, any ideas?
Yeah, that's a good one because you're right. I can control my character, but I can't necessarily control my reputation. Somebody wants
Mm,
to drag me down and
mm,
they want to post all over social media some horrible things about me. I could spend the next couple days doing damage control and trying to share my side of the story. I don't think that's necessarily a worthwhile effort. People that know me personally are probably not going to believe stories if they're completely made up. But then you're right. How do you just let that go of, well, I'm not going to respond to that? It's much easier said than done. So I would probably say to create a really short script for yourself that might just be like the word self-respect. And every time I'm
Mm,
tempted to draft that email that I'm never going to send, or I'm thinking of 800 replies that would feel really good to send, it's going to say, no, Amy, have some self-respect and
mm,
decide consciously I'm going to use my time, my energy, and my mental bandwidth on things that are much more important. So that while, yes, I could spend 6 hours drafting this angry email, I could also spend 6 hours building relationships with friends and
yeah.
family or doing nice things for other people or doing something that really matters to me to improve my life. And I think with practice, that gets easier to be able to let those things go. But in
Mm,
those early moments too, or the times when we've made those mistakes, because we all do, just repeating self-respect and then figuring out what would I rather be doing with my time rather than trying to do all this? Because it's so easy because we know once you start doing some of that stuff, you get sucked into the vortex and suddenly you're answering 50 emails or monitoring your text messages all evening or trying to talk to 100 different people to share your side of the story. And it's probably not going to end in a position where you think, I'm so glad that I spent my time doing that.
yeah, I don't think so. I'm curious, kind of a sidetrack here, but for you, is there any of this mental strength stuff that you struggle with, or are you the mental strength Buddha at this point? Do you feel like you have it all down, or how's that for you?
Yeah, good question. So, no, in fact, when I wrote the list of 13 things mentally strong people don't do, it was because I did all 13 of those things. I was
Mm,
in one of the lowest points of my life. I had lost my mother. A few years later, I lost my husband, and I was about to lose my father-in-law and needed that letter for myself. I didn't even mean to really make it go viral or didn't intend to write a book or anything like that. It was just what I needed. On the worst days of my life, the last thing I wanted was a to-do list of 100 things I should do today. But I said, if I just wake up and I don't do these things, I'll make it through the day. And I thought, well, this list is helpful to me. So after a few days, I thought, what if I put it on the internet? Maybe it would help somebody else. But then 50 million people read it. I got a book deal, and I still get to speak about mental strength. But certainly, just because I wrote the book doesn't mean that I was able to put all of these things into practice. I feel like it's a work in progress. And that different seasons of my life, it's easy to say, yeah, I don't feel sorry for myself. Well, of course not. When life is going well, it's really easy to feel like, yeah, I feel really good. But when things start getting subtracted from your life, it's much harder to then not say, like, this isn't fair. I deserve better. So even though it's been 10 years since I wrote that original list, I still work on all of these things all the time. And some are a little easier than others. And it just depends on the situation, who's around me, what's going on in my life, and figuring out what is it that I still need to work on. When it comes to mental strength, it's sort of like physical strength. It's
yeah.
not like you're ever done. You can still keep working on it. And if you quit working on it, your muscles get kind of weak. Mental strength's the same. There are so many things, and I'm humbled over and over again as a reminder of things I still have to work on.
And back to the giving up your power, are there behaviors specifically that we can, sometimes you have these, sort of concise, nice lists and things. If that's one that people really get confused about the most, if when the people struggle with the most, we just kind of, I know you said you don't want to make a whole to-do list, but if there were, what would be the keys on that?
So one would just be catching yourself again, thinking that somebody else has the power over either how you think, feel, or behave.
Hmm.
And a big way that's reflected in our lives is through our language. So when I say so and so makes me feel bad, like, well, I just gave that person power over my emotions. Or when I say my boss makes me work late, or my mother-in-law makes me go over there for dinner on Sundays, I have to. All of those words are implying again that I'm a victim of these other people. So taking back our power can just be about changing your language. I get to do these things, or I'm choosing to, or this person's mood affected me, but it didn't make me feel bad. My choices are now that I can go do something different. So I think changing our language is a big one. And then also just being more proactive about the choices that we make and the behavior that we choose so that we don't end up just being the passive victim of whatever's going on around us, that you feel like you're just getting tugged from one place to the next and you're going with the flow. Like, no, what do I really want to be doing? How do I want to spend my day? How do I want to spend my time? Was it a day well spent? And at the end of the day, we can always ask ourselves, like, what did I do today to grow mentally stronger? My favorite question to ask yourself before you go to bed. there's so many things throughout the day I couldn't control, but I could always control if I did something to grow mentally stronger. So, like, all right, what did I do well today? Maybe I spoke up in a conversation. Maybe I kept my mouth shut in a conversation. All depends on what it is that you're working on and the changes you want to make. But just acknowledging that, I think, empowers us to say, okay, I did this thing well today. And then we start to look at what can I do well tomorrow, too.
You also write about entitlement and you have experience treating people with narcissistic personality disorder. I'm curious, what do you see with people's entitlement at those extremes? How does it affect their lives?
Yeah, so I see a lot of people who, again, just kind of talk about all the things that they deserve. Like, I'm
Mm.
smarter than everybody else. I've been through way worse than you have, but
Mm.
I've also experienced way better than you have. And they definitely enjoy talking about all of those things and making it known that I've suffered more, but I'm happier, yet my life is better and worse. And those sorts of attitudes, of course, make it difficult to be around somebody. But at the same time, strangely, people are often very charming and they can suck you in and cause you to either feel sorry for them at just the right moment or also hail them a hero. And strangely, too, we know that in business, narcissistic leaders are much more likely to get promoted, much more likely to climb the ladder. And it's so frustrating for the people around them who have figured this out and they're watching it happen because they will walk into a room with full confidence saying, this is exactly what we need to do, this is how we do it. And sometimes leaders fall for that trap thinking this person's confident, they're self assured, what could go wrong? And there is some research that in a time of crisis, the narcissistic person is the one you want in charge because they'll say, don't worry, I've got this, as opposed to an unsure leader who says, we're going to do our best here, but no guarantees. We want the person who says, no, we've got this. But so many times in life, we feel like those sorts of people will tell us that they deserve the position that they're in because they're so smart, they're wise, they've gotten there. And it's difficult because you think, we're all human beings. You're no more entitled than the rest of us. But I see that a lot. And of course, social media hasn't made narcissism get any better by any stretch. It's made it a lot worse and given people more of a platform and an outlet to use people to attract them to use their power for things that can be harmful too.
You mentioned how people see it happening in front of them. They recognize that someone is of this sort of trait, and yet they have to put up with it. Um, Back to this sort of having your own power thing. Is there something to exposing when you see these traits in another person?
You can certainly say, like, I'm going to go to my supervisor, we'll go to HR, I'm going to talk about this. The problem is that when somebody sees somebody in that light, your opinion is probably not going to change it. So if your boss is looking at this narcissistic person thinking, like, this is the best thing that's ever happened to our company, you saying, I have some concerns might not work out very well. So sometimes it's about figuring that out. Like, how am I just going to accept that perhaps eventually this will work out the way that it's meant to, and I don't say anything. But certainly there are times too that you can call somebody out if you have a narcissistic person in the office who's always taking credit for ideas that aren't theirs. You can also be an ally and be like, I think that was Jimmy's idea last week, wasn't it? And be the one who points that out. But then you have to be ready because you're probably going to get some wrath and backlash toward you because narcissistic people, if you attempt to embarrass them or you shine any light on what's really going on, they often want to punish you, put you down, and they'll go to great lengths to try to embarrass you or shame you.
Mhm. And they'll do it through others if they can to
Correct.
have a shield, and the manipulation strategies are remarkable. They may also paint you as envious. Envy
Yeah.
is another thing that you've written about. What causes envy?
So it's a mixture of not just thinking that somebody has something that you want, but then it's thinking they also don't deserve to have it. So in our heads, we start to stack up like how fair that is. Well, this person's not a very nice person, so they don't deserve that promotion. But I'm nice, so I deserve it more than they do. And that's when we start to get envious of somebody thinking, I'm more deserving than they are. And we want to get back to this place of fairness where we think we know what's fair and somehow the universe isn't doling it out appropriately. So sometimes we then even want to take action. If I think somebody's getting more attention or an undeserved promotion or their business is doing better than mine, even though they don't deserve it in my brain, that's when people get into saying, I'm going to leave you a negative review, or I'm going to start spreading rumors about you online because I don't want you to have these things that I want, because it feels like it takes it away from me, as opposed to recognizing that just because you're doing well doesn't mean I can't do well. And it's not up to me to decide who's more deserving. You have a goal, I have a goal. You can reach your goal. I could also reach my goal, but I don't have to sabotage you in order for me to reach mine.
And so envy is sort of natural. Maybe do you have a story of someone you've worked with who's dealt with envy, or maybe a situation from your therapy practice?
Yeah, tons of them for sure. And it's something that a lot, we don't like to admit to. We just want to
Right.
talk about my life isn't fair. So I've never had anybody walk into my therapy office saying like, "Hey, I really am envious of people." But I can think of this one person who had a bad back. He was applying for disability, was denied, tried again, denied, and was on his third and final appeal. And walks into the therapy office one day, and there's a one of my coworkers has a client who's waiting, and that client happened to be somebody who used a wheelchair. So my client says very loudly, like, "Look how lucky that person is. He gets disability." And it led to a conversation that day about like, okay, if somebody's life, somebody's using a wheelchair, perhaps they do get disability, but you then start to think that person's more fortunate than I am, and sort of this hierarchy that we create in our brains of who's better, who's worse, and what all of that means about us, and how if this person has something that I want, it takes it away from me. And when we look at things like with social media too, because the social media algorithms are designed to make us compare ourselves and to make us more envious of other people, because that keeps us coming back because we want to know how they're doing. And we enjoy it when people who were doing well take a fall, or when we think they're not doing as well as they were before. And we also know that even like the number of happy birthday messages people get on Facebook, for instance, leads to envy, where somebody thinks that person's life is better than mine. They have more friends than I do. Or vacation photos can be particularly triggering when it comes to envy, of thinking they got to go to Greece, they're on this amazing vacation, they're on a beach somewhere. How nice for them. And we create this narrative in our head that their life must be so much better than ours. And then we start to think, well, my life is awful. I haven't been anywhere cool in a really long time. My life isn't good enough. That person's better. And it really affects our own self-worth, where we then start to put ourselves down. And all of those things are directly linked to our mental health and how we're functioning as humans when we start to create our own social hierarchies and we're putting ourselves in there. So for a lot of people, then the best way to feel like they're moving up the social hierarchy then is, well, I have to knock out somebody else down. This is where you get the internet trolls who are making fun of people, because it's the only way they can say, I feel like I'm taking back some power in a strange way. So I feel like I'm just moving up one little notch. If I put you down, I feel like I've moved above you. Very similar to what you see in the third grade, yet we see it play out with adults on social media all the time. And often it just really stems from that envy of assuming somebody else's life is so much better than ours that we have to knock them down a peg or two. Or we turn around and just pick on somebody else because that kind of makes us feel better for a second, but nobody feels good being an internet troll.
Do you think?
Right?
I don't know. I mean, if you do it that much, if they must get some juice out of it.
Certainly, because we wouldn't do something if you don't get something out of it. The problem is it makes you feel good for about 10 seconds. And then you have to do it again in order to get that boost again. So it's very short-lived little boost of like, ha ha ha, I got this person. But at the end of the day, if you left 400 mean comments, you don't then feel empowered, like, ah, what a great, amazing day I had. Although some people, of course, do disguise it as, I'm being a social justice warrior, I'm doing these
Mhm.
things. But I think ultimately people who do that, they're not really building healthy, credible self-esteem, but they are getting that little boost for a few seconds that then makes them want to do it again.
Yeah, it's sort of a deception of yourself and a manipulation, kind of playing a savior in your own mind.
Right.
So, getting out of these things, we're talking a lot about change. Another one of your chapters is that mentally strong people don't shy away from change. Now, in relationships, especially if you are with someone who is abusing you, a dark personality, it can seem impossible to leave that person. And there are a number of reasons for that. They probably have isolated you from other people. They've immersed you in a world where everybody thinks they're perfect. You're under all sorts of manipulation, cognitive dissonance that is going to leave you confused. You're getting gaslighted. You're weakened. all of that, what's the most persuasive argument for making a small change when you're in a bad relationship?
So a lot of people I work with will say, things are predictable. And the last thing I want to do is make anything worse.
Mm,
So when it comes down to that, it's really about then saying, well, how long could I stand this? So let's say I was in this exact situation tomorrow. Could I stand it? People usually say, yeah. But what if it was still like this 6 months from now? And sometimes people will say, oh, I don't want to live like this in 6 months, or a year just becomes unfathomable. They think, I can't spend another year in this awful relationship or living in this distress. And sometimes that helps people make the change or find the courage to say, if I don't want to be like this in 6 months, well, then yeah, it's going to be hard to make a change tomorrow, but I need to make it because if I don't, I'm going to be in this exact same situation. And for some people too, then it's about just taking that step back, recognizing, okay, I don't want to do this long term. So then what's that one small thing I could do tomorrow? Maybe I reach out to somebody, maybe I join a support group, maybe I find a friend I haven't spoken to in a while, or maybe I could tell somebody the truth about what my relationship is because they think it's perfect. But what if I were to tell my friend, actually, behind the scenes, things aren't quite what they look like, and just see what happens?
so if you're in the throes of manipulation, that's still really hard. Is there anything that you would recommend that people do to stabilize themselves in some way before trying to make a change or to make the change easier or to better tolerate the change?
I think if everybody had somebody that they could run things by, it
Mm,
would be great. Whether we're talking about a friend, a family member, a therapist, your neighbor, or even a stranger, if you can find somebody online who can relate. Because sometimes we need that like reality check of like, is this normal? Or this person's telling me that I'm crazy because of X, Y, and Z. Is that true? Because people will start to doubt their own minds, and then they're like, I can't trust my judgment. My partner's saying X, Y, and Z, but I don't know. Maybe they're the ones who's struggling right now and they're just not showing it. So if we have somebody objective that we can run these things by who can say, no, you don't deserve to be treated like that, or here's why they're telling you this. It's because they're manipulating you or they're gaslighting you over here. That can be so helpful for people. So if you have somebody in your life who can help with that, incredibly empowering. If you don't, another strategy sometimes is to just write things down, whether we're talking about a journal or you have a password protected a laptop or a phone where you know that nothing's going to be read, just to kind of start making sense of the things going on, the behavior that you see, the thoughts running through your head, and getting it out on a piece of paper or on a laptop screen just to help you start making more sense of what's going on. And it also gives you a better look at the bigger picture of, okay, I've been in this for 3 years. Here's the things going on, the day-to-day struggles that I face. Here's what I'm worried about. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's what I'm afraid would happen if I made a change. What are the pros and cons? But anything you can do, I think, to get those things on paper helps us make more sense of the situation too.
yeah, I love both of those, and I'll just add that both of those were very relevant for me when I got away from a person like this. It was I had a friend who had seen what was going on for a long time, and she's a doctor, and so she knew what was going on, but she didn't want to alienate me because she knew
Yep.
I'd need a friend, and she knew I probably wouldn't listen at first. And then eventually one day we were talking, and it was kind of like the Matrix. She kind of unplugged me and said, "He's got something called narcissistic personality disorder, and it's real, and you need to understand it." And then I went back and I made a timeline. I said, okay, what are the things that I've written about in my journal? What are the things that I've documented here and there that were big problems? Oh, and in some, this is all very clear now. But it
Yeah.
was both. It was another person and it was the things in writing that put it all together. So I love both of those strategies. When you do decide to get away from someone like this, the narcissist will often isolate you from the people who are still close to them, and they will smear campaign you. Um, you have a chapter about not fearing time alone. That can be harder for some people than the actual experience. That abuse after, when you try to get away, is often the most dangerous time, and the betrayal that people experience is so painful. What advice do you have for people about not fearing that alone time?
Yeah, that is a tough one because even if we're getting negative attention or you're in a really stressful situation, it's a distraction from
Yeah.
so many of those uncomfortable emotions. And it feels better sometimes to be angry than it does to be sad. Or when we're so stressed out, you can't think straight. You're just not experiencing all of those other emotions because you're just worried about what's happening right now. So a lot of people will say that, like, now it's kind of quiet, or now I have all of these things going on. I don't even know which one to deal with. Do I attempt to address the smear campaign? Do I try to work on this, or am I going to work on my health? Do I join the gym? I don't know. And just figuring out which way is up and which way is down. So sometimes it's important to just take a step back and start labeling your emotions. And it could be as easy as you're going to hang a list of feeling words on your bathroom mirror when you brush your teeth in the morning and hopefully again at night. You read over that list and you say, like, how do I feel today? And a lot of times we struggle with to even find the language. When I ask people in my office, like, about how they're feeling, they'll be like, well, I thought he was an idiot. Well, that's a thought. It's not an emotion. How do you feel? And when people get beyond, say, mad, sad, happy, angry, we kind of run out of feeling words. But it feels a lot better when we can really pinpoint, like, I was frustrated, I was disappointed. And when we get into those little nuanced words, that can really help us feel better. But it does something too. When your brain and your body make sense of what's going on and you name an emotion, it takes a lot of the sting out of it. Tons of research behind that that will say just naming an emotion helps. And then another good step is to then say, well, is what I'm feeling right now my friend or my enemy? We tend to talk about emotions as if they're all positive or negative. Like, oh, anger's a negative emotion, but excitement's a positive emotion. Well, it's not true. Any emotion has the power to be positive or negative at any given moment. If you were excited about a get rich quick scheme, it's not a helpful emotion in that moment because you
Mm,
forget there's a downside. But on the other hand, if you're angry about something, sometimes that gives you courage. But on the downside, it also sometimes might make you say something really mean to somebody and that you later regret. So asking yourself in that moment, how do I feel today? And then is it my friend or my enemy? If you're sad and you're just kind of rehashing some things from the past, it might help you honor what you've lost. But if you're so sad you can't get out of bed, it's not helpful. Or if you're so anxious you can't function, it's also not helpful. But sometimes anxiety gives us the motivation to say, I have to pay my bills because they're due on Friday. If you didn't have any anxiety, you might not care. So just checking in with yourself. How do I feel? Is it my friend or my enemy? And then, like, what am I going to do today to take care of those emotions so that they don't control my life? If you're not careful, they can cause you to make some poor decisions. If you're really lonely, you might be tempted to text your ex. Or if you're really anxious, you might be tempted to jump into one of those conversations and defend yourself. So, like, how do I feel? Is it helpful today? And how might it lead me astray? And how am I going to take care of that emotion too? And come up with a plan for yourself.
mm. With the betrayal part, is there a way to plan for that? Is there a way to come up with a plan to deal with that?
Again, I think it goes back to then just figuring out, like, what are the emotions that I feel? Am I embarrassed? Am I feeling
Mm,
like angry with myself for making that decision, for trusting somebody?
mm,
And then how might that affect me? Might I be afraid to trust people in the future? And of course, hindsight's 2020. So sometimes we come up with, well, here's 50 red flags I missed, or I should have seen this coming. And we beat ourselves up for it when in reality, this person worked really, really hard to get our trust. So, of course, we didn't see the red flags then. And to just be careful of the story that we tell ourselves, because sometimes people will say, yeah, clearly I'm not good enough. Clearly I'm attracted to people who treat me poorly. So, therefore, I'm doomed to do it again.
mm.
And then put themselves in those situations. So be careful of that narrative that we tell ourselves and to just take a deep dive into all of those emotions and then the thoughts that you have around that. Like, yes, you trusted somebody and they betrayed you, and that is horrible. And it's unfortunate that it happened, but it doesn't mean that you're doomed and that the next person is going to do the same thing to you.
I'll add to that narrative about being doomed or self-blaming too. I've read lots of research, I've talked to lots of experts, and many are very clear that if you deal with someone who's a predator, it does not take two to tango.
Correct.
You could be a very healthy person and get targeted and be pulled into a sophisticated deception, con artistry, basically, and that there has to be some release as well.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up because while we'd all like to think, well, I wouldn't fall for somebody like that, the truth is every single one of us can fall prey to somebody who wants to take advantage of us. That there are plenty of people who are well versed in preying on others and they know exactly how to do it, which buttons to push, what things to say, how to do it. They have it down to a science because they have spent their lives doing exactly this. And you can't always tell on the surface who's who. And so for most of us, again, we'd like to think I wouldn't do that. We absolutely would. And in knowing though that just because that person did it doesn't mean the next person's going to do the same thing to you.
Mhm. With the betrayal, we talked about that one person. What they'll often do is poison the people around them as well, so that you may have friends who've been by you for years. Some people, I've heard even family, who suddenly won't talk to you, cross the street when they see you coming. The betrayal from those people, how to deal with that when it's the blame issue is messy, they're being manipulated as well. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. And that's a good point too. And I think it's about remembering I fell prey to this person. So I
Hmm.
shouldn't judge my cousin, my mother, whoever it is, for also falling prey. They tricked me. So I have no doubt that they can trick that person too. And sometimes that helps a little bit. And then also to know there's a chance maybe this other person's going to turn around in 3 years. Maybe they'll see that it's different, or maybe in 2 weeks, or maybe when they get the rest of the story from somebody else, they'll figure it out. And to try not to hold it against them too much. But yeah, that absolutely stings to think this person has known me, they've seen my character, and yet they're still believing this other story. That's tough. And then you have to decide, do I call them and plead my case, or do I just let it go and let them come to their own circumstances? But I think the best thing to do is to always just focus on from today forward, how do I want to live my life? What's my character going to
Mm.
be? And in some cases, it might be about making that phone call. There might be other cases where you say, I'm not going to bother to do that. It might be that the relationship with that person is damaged through no fault of my own, and I'm going to move forward regardless.
To this loneliness and isolation, you've also written about a light side to that, which is solitude. What is solitude? What are the benefits, the joys, maybe, of solitude?
Yeah, there are so many. And even when I talk about this, people will say, well, I love my alone time. I'll say, oh, what do you do when you're alone? They're like, well, I watch movies and I'm scrolling through social media, I'm listening to podcasts. So they're not really alone with their thoughts. And in today's world, you have to be incredibly proactive to make that happen, to silence your devices and to even take 5 minutes to sit without noise is tough to do. You have to be incredibly proactive about making that happen, carving out that time. So whether you sit and you journal for 5 minutes a day or you meditate or just do some mindfulness practices, it's important to do that though, because your brain's always going to be with you. You might as well make peace with the voices inside your head and to figure out like, what am I thinking? What's really going on? And so many people will say, well, my brain just doesn't shut off. And that's good. It's not supposed to shut off, but we have to give it some time to really plan, to think, to manage all this stuff going on throughout the day. So many people will say, I put my head down at the end of the day when I go to sleep, and then my brain starts running through the whole day. And it's yes, because you probably didn't give it 10 minutes during the day to just sit and think. So sometimes it's important to carve out that time in little doses, but to get more comfortable in our skin too. There's research that will show just going on a date with yourself once every other week or so can do wonders for our comfort inside our own skin, for who we are, gets the opportunity to get to know yourself better. Again, there's pressure when somebody says, where do you want to go out to dinner? We're thinking about them. What do you want to do after dinner? Well, what do you want to do? When we start doing things on our own, we're like, oh, yeah, actually, I do like Mexican food better. And after I get done eating, I like to go for a walk in the park because there's no social pressure on us. So we know from the research that people who get more comfortable with themselves tend to live happier, longer, healthier lives, but they'll also say that it was a life well lived. While social contact is definitely important, being comfortable in your own skin because you're always going to be there no matter what relationships you're in or breakups you go through or you move across the country. Like you just want to make sure that you also have a relationship with yourself.
And we're talking about getting away from relationships, being alone. With that comes grief. You've written a lot about your own experiences with grief, losing people through death. Um, there's also a risk of self-pity. How do we grieve effectively, not fall into the trap of self-pity?
Sadness is important. You don't really get to enjoy the more comfortable emotions like happiness unless you also let yourself feel sad. But sadness crosses over to self-pity when we start thinking about how I deserve better, I don't deserve this. Or we dig in our heels and we start saying things like, my life is never going to get any better. We magnify how awful it is. This is the worst thing ever. And we start underestimating our own abilities. Like, I could never work through this. I could never get through that. And we just really convince ourselves that life is going to stay horrible and awful and there's nothing we can do about it. And when we get stuck in this state, it's when somebody else says, "Hey, have you tried?" And we're like, "Yeah, none of that's going to work. Nothing works for me." And we don't even want to try anything differently. Instead, we get really attached to being in a dark place and we want to stay there forever and ever. And that's when it starts to become unhealthy because we start to become hopeless and then we become a bit helpless too. And we don't do anything to make our lives any better.
Yeah, I think you wrote self-pity is self-destruction, something along those lines.
Yeah, it really is. When somebody says, my life is horrible and awful, there's nothing I can do about it. Well, then you look for the awful things in the world and then you will make it so. We like it when our outside matches our inside. So if I feel like the world is terrible, horrible, and awful, I will make it terrible, horrible, and awful. If an opportunity comes my way, I'll say no. If I have the opportunity to do something that would make my life better, I won't do it. In fact, I'll make it worse because then I think, see, now I have a reason to have an awful life and I'm justified in how I feel.
Another quote from your book: "We do not heal the past for dwelling there. We heal the past by living fully in the present." What's the relationship between that dwelling and healing and grieving? They seem to run together.
They do, and reflecting on the past is helpful and then learning from it. But when we stay stuck, like sometimes I'll see somebody that will be 45 and they say, well, I had a really bad childhood, so therefore I can't have a good adulthood. And they're just really convinced that because something awful happened to them when they were a kid, that the future is doomed too. And that's where we don't want to be, where we end up just rehashing, ruminating, being so stuck in the past that you can't make your future good, but you also miss out on the present. And in my case, because I lost my mother and I lost my husband by the time I was 26, look, the past is where they lived. So it was just tempting to stay stuck there, to say, I'm going to leave my house like a museum, everything the way that it was, and I'm going to uh, continue to just live in those memories as opposed to make new ones. I could have done that, but certainly wouldn't have been able to create a very good life for myself moving forward if I'd chosen to stay stuck there.
That staying stuck in the past, that the possibility of doing things like that is real. I remember reading in your book, you had a story of the man who wrote the Peter Pan story.
Yeah.
I was blown away. I've seen Peter Pan a million times, but I didn't know. Could you share?
Yeah, and so in his story, it was about his mom, and they had always treated him like a kid, and he was just really stuck in this idea that he was gonna like stay young forever, but not in a good way. And his entire life had played out in sort of this tragic way of thinking that Never Never Land, he was never gonna grow up.
And hadn't his brother died? And he just kind of
Yeah.
he was filling in the role of the brother as well, the favorite brother.
Yes, yes, that's it exactly. His brother had passed away, and so yeah, he stepped into the role of the brother. That's right. And the mom, I'm trying to remember, it's something about the mom was the way that the mom always treated him too, and it kept him just stuck there.
Yeah, your story was amazing to me. It even kept him physically small. It seemed
Right.
he just didn't physically grow properly. It was this the way that we can keep ourselves in the past that was explaining that story to me. Just I found it amazing.
Yeah, and it does. And I think for a lot of people, there when we become so entrenched in something, and it might be the role that we played as a kid. Somebody says, "Well, I was the chubby nerd," or I had the label of being the shy kid who didn't talk. Whatever it was, we hold on to that label so much because it becomes our identity that then we don't ever do anything different. And so then it absolutely becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So many times in life where we think, well, that's not me. I'm not the kind of person who could do X, Y, or Z because it doesn't fit with where I was as a kid. And so, like in this example, yeah, he's physically stunted as well. It affected his growth. And I think for people to know that so many of those things do take a physical toll on us in many ways too, our emotional toll, our physical toll, cognitive toll, but it's really easy to decide this is my identity and then to stay stuck in it if we don't want to outgrow that label.
So how do we stop? How do we stop the dwelling? How do we end that?
So I think sometimes it's just about challenging some of those beliefs that we hold on to. So I was the kid that didn't talk as a kid. I probably could have been diagnosed not just with social anxiety, but probably selective mutism at times because I literally didn't talk. I had friends and family who were very happy to talk for me. My older sister and my outgoing friends would be like, "Hey, Amy needs this," and I would be like, "That's great." So the fact that I would then grow up to become a podcast host or that I would be a speaker would have been completely off my radar. And I think had I never tried those little things, I would have never known that I, in fact, actually enjoyed speaking publicly. But until we start to get rid of some of those things in a way where we say, you know what? No, I'm not the kind of person who does this, but today I'm going to try it anyway. Or what kind of person do I want to be? Do I want to be a confident person? Well, then I'm going to act like a confident person acts. Or do I want to be a friendly person? Well, we'll start acting like I feel that way already. And when we change our behavior, like our brain will then follow. So then your brain starts to say, oh, maybe you are that kind of a person. And your mood shifts too when you start to do those things. Like, all right, maybe I am that kind of a person. So I'm all for sometimes catching those self-limiting beliefs and then saying, I want to challenge that. What could I do differently? And what would I be doing if I didn't have that label placed on me?
In this grieving and healing process too, another thing that you caution against in life is expecting immediate results. How can we deal with that sort of impatience to feel better, to heal, to grieve?
That one's a tough one because so many things these days are instant, right? When I was a kid, I couldn't order something online and get it delivered in 24 hours like you can now. Things were much slower back then. And in our world, as things have become more and more fast-paced, we expect everything to be fast. Oh, I started taking depression medication yesterday. How come I don't feel better today? Or I've been working on my self-limiting beliefs for 1 week now, and it hasn't gotten fixed yet. Or I've been grieving for 2 days and I don't feel better yet. So it's really about just looking for those small changes again to know that your life isn't going to change all at once. But what's one thing maybe today that was a little bit better than yesterday? And focusing on those, or if you wanted to say lose weight, nobody wants to say, I want to lose 1 pound this week. We all want to be like, hey, I'm going to lose 100 pounds. But then it's really hard to stick the course when we have a big, big, giant goal in front of us. So it's about looking at those little things like, what is it I could do today? What can I do this week? Sometimes just marking something on a calendar. There's research that will show this. If you want to go to the gym more often, you could get all sorts of fancy things and everything from equipment to clothing and whatever else. But the one thing that helps people actually go to the gym more is you take a paper calendar and you put an X on the days that you go to the calendar, that you go to the gym. And then because you're looking at the calendar, you're like, oh, I only went 3 times this week. I'm gonna go today after all. And I think those little things that just remind us that even though I'm not exactly where I want to be, I have made progress and here's what I'm doing today. And any kind of habit tracker, any kind of small step that we can take, and then to just be able to acknowledge I'm making progress. It might not be 0 to 100, but I'm getting there slowly. And then to trust that when something takes a lot of time, appreciate it so much more when you get there. If something were easy and it only takes 12 hours to do it, we'd think, well, that was kind of neat. But if you spent 10 years working on something and you get there, it feels so much better once you finally are there.
So we're talking about progress and tolerating the process, but also when you get there, how can we know with a healing process when we get there?
So, one thing I discourage people from doing is to talk about themselves as if they're broken. Like you might have a broken bone and then it heals and you know when it's healed. Well, as human beings, we're not broken and then you're suddenly healed. It's a process. And to know that it's not going to heal just like a emotional wound might heal because you've got a band-aid on it. Like our emotions don't really work like that, that there's always going to be different ways in which we're affected by the things that have happened to us, our life experiences. But we can still be a work in progress. So knowing I'm not exactly where I want to be, but I'm much better than where I used to be. And just reminding ourselves of that, I think. And what else do I want to change about myself? What do I appreciate about the changes that I've made? And I'm hopeful that all of us will keep growing as time goes on. Like I would never want to be like, well, here I am. I'm evolved. I don't need to do anything differently. Life would be fairly boring from here on out if any of us made that declaration of, I've made all the changes I need to make. Hopefully, we keep learning and growing and we stay curious about ourselves and about everything going on so that we can continue to grow and feel like there's still things we can do. And to not feel like there is this holy grail of there's one thing out there that would quote unquote heal me and I haven't found it yet, so therefore I'm not good enough. Because I see a lot of people that will feel like that too. Like, I still struggle with anxiety, so therefore I'm not healed. But they're doing so much research about all these things that could cure anxiety. And they're like, but I haven't found the one thing that's going to work for me yet. It might not be one thing. You may need to do a bunch of different things in life to feel like you're getting the most out of every day.
Definitely. Amy Morin, before I ask my last question, where should people look for you online?
Oh, so my website is Amy Morin, LCSW, as in licensed clinical social worker.com. And on my website, I have info about all of my books, my podcast, which is called Mentally Stronger with therapist Amy Morin, and a new app I just developed that's called Mentally Strong.
Great. We'll put links to all of that in the description for people to check out. And I said last question, it's really a last topic. We might have a few. Is about trusting people after going through, a tough relationship, grieving all of that. First of all, there's a fear of failure in going back to people, going back to relationships, being exposed again. How do we deal with the fear of failure?
I think acknowledging that before we dive into anything, to just think, okay, I'm afraid, I'm nervous, I'm anxious, and then thinking, how might that play out? How might that affect me? Let's say you're dating somebody new and you're keep thinking, oh, this might not work out. Well, how might that affect your behavior? Maybe you don't really show up. You're not present with the person. You don't want it to turn into that self-fulfilling prophecy where you think this relationship isn't going to work out. So then you only put in 30% effort anyway. And then when it fails, you think, well, I told myself that was going to happen and it did. So I would say it goes back to acknowledging, how do I feel? How might that affect my behavior? And what can I do despite feeling that? And anytime we have that fear of failure, it's also important then to celebrate your courage on the other end of the spectrum to say, this is scary and I'm doing it anyway. So I'm going to be pleased with the fact that I'm showing up and I'm still here, and be proud of yourself just for showing up.
Now, when you have been tricked by someone, how can you make sure that you learn to never ever go back there again?
So take a few deep breaths, I think, and really just look at like what's the story? Because you can always tell the same story from so many different angles. You might look back and think that's the story of the time I was an idiot, made all sorts of poor choices, got taken advantage of. Or you might say, that's the story of somebody who went through something difficult and emerged and was kind of scarred, but at the same time is so brave and is so willing to go forward and get into a new relationship and is going to make better choices. Or this person who emerged from that relationship is now somebody who's going to turn around and help other people, or who's going to say, I'm not going to hold on to the shame. I'm going to share my story with others. So many ways to tell the same story. So just take a look at like what's the story you're telling yourself about what you just went through? How might you shift that story? Is there a different way to tell it so that you can feel good instead of saying I'm a victim of horrible circumstances? The better story is usually I'm a survivor of something incredibly difficult, and because of that, here's how I'm even stronger moving forward.
That's reminding me of another story in your book too. A young boy gets hit by a school bus,
Yeah.
and he reframes the story as how I got hit by a school bus and survived, or how I beat the school bus, or something like that. And perhaps that's the idea here too. Is instead of oh, I was an idiot and got conned by a psychopath, it's no, I had a run-in with a psychopath, but you got through it.
And right. And I think that's it. And just that slight shift in this story of like, wow, I just went through something incredibly difficult and I survived it. And here I am still, that you're a warrior, not a victim necessarily of something awful.
A quote from your book to kind of round things out. Developing mental strength means knowing that you'll be okay no matter what. That's not what I think a lot of people would think mental strength is. What is that really? What does that look like? It kind of sounds like confidence.
Yeah. So sometimes people are like, no, it's okay it's okay to not be okay, which is true. Like you don't have to be happy all the time or anything, but to know that it's not just about succeeding at everything. I was hearing so many, say, Navy SEALs who were like, never quit, never fail, push through everything at all cost. But I think true strength sometimes is about quitting. It's about knowing you're going to fail and that's okay. And it's about knowing that you might not have the kind of life that you expected to live, but that's okay too. And that you'll be okay regardless of whatever circumstances you end up finding yourself in. You'll make it out on the other side. And part of that is a confidence, I think, in knowing who you are and just knowing, okay, I've been through tough stuff before. I can get through whatever life throws my way next time too.
Well, Amy Morin, thank you so much for your book and for your work and for taking this time to do this interview with me. It means a lot. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
To help raise awareness about narcissistic abuse, please share this video. It helps a lot.